Now, I don't claim to understand humans. I mean, I'm a buffalo after all. I've seen a lot in my days on the prairies, but I've never seen anything like what went down on April 2nd, 1885. I'll tell you what happened that day. This is the story of the Frog Lake Massacre. That day, Wandering Spirit's piercing stare broke from the crimson sunrise. He turns his gaze towards the sleeping village of Duck Lake. His strong, straight nose and deep sunken cheeks, framed by the flaming red sun, made a perfect picture. Except for his unusual wavy hair, he was the perfect image of the noble savage the settlers loved to write about. Wandering Spirit believed that the settlers were the ones who were the savages. How could they be so heartless? How could they sit back and just watch the Cree die of diseases brought on by not having enough to eat, while their fort was stocked with food? His heart was bursting with hatred, nurtured from 40 years of watching the buffalo disappear from the prairies. We buffalo tried to hide, but it's hard to hide on the prairies, especially when you're as big as us. That hatred was seasoned with 40 years of watching his society fall apart around him. His thin lips turned into a cruel smile as he thought of the settlers who were doing so well, while he had to watch his own family and friends die. Dates meant nothing to Wandering Spirit, but April 2nd, 1885 would go down in Canadian history as the day that he struck back. Wandering Spirit's moment of solitude was short-lived. The pounding of the war drums coursed through his veins, making him ready for action. The small, peaceful settlement of Frog Lake was about to pay for all the hardships that Wandering Spirit and his people had to endure at the hands of the government. Frog Lake was 10 miles north of the Saskatchewan River, and 5 miles west of nowhere. The handful of settlers who lived in the area were defenseless against the great number of Cree who made up Big Bear's band. Although settlers knew the rebellion was in the air, they thought that the bond they had made with their Cree neighbors would hold. They knew that Chief Big Bear was a man to be trusted. Unfortunately, they didn't know that Big Bear had lost control of his people, and now Wandering Spirit was calling the shots. He was calling for gunshots. Wandering Spirit's first move was to send his men to the houses of the settlers. He went personally to the home of the Indian agent Quinn, a man whom he despised. Wandering Spirit burst through the door. He snatched 3 guns that were hanging and called for Quinn to come downstairs. "You are my prisoner," Wandering Spirit told him. The Cree rounded up the settlers and took them to Quinn's house. He eventually let them go to round them up again at about 9:30 a.m. This time, Wandering Spirit demanded that they gather in the church. When the settlers saw Wandering Spirit, they shook with fear. He had smeared his eyelids and lips with thick yellow ochre, and his face was set in a hideous sneer. Other Cree had done the same, and they stood guarding the church. Big Bear appeared and stood at the back of the church. He hoped that his presence could stop the violence for which Wandering Spirit was lusting. All of the settlers and Métis gathered in the church. The priest was in the process of celebrating Mass, and he tried to ignore the distractions of the excited Cree and terrified settlers. The congregation was kneeling when Wandering Spirit strolled into the church. He stalked forward with determination. For the priest, Wandering Spirit's lynx-skin war bonnet, crowned with 5 large eagle feathers, made a grotesque parody to the Jesus' crown of thorns on that Good Friday Mass. To the horror of the settlers, Wandering Spirit dropped to his right knee with his Winchester held tightly in his right hand. Time stopped for a moment as Wandering Spirit froze in that position. Every instinct told him to shoot, yet something held him back. Astonishingly, Wandering Spirit changed his mind and told his prisoners to get out of the church. The settlers hurriedly left the church, and once outside they were dismayed to see that many Cree were now in war paint. Like Wandering Spirit, they adorned themselves with feathers. They mixed the feathers with porcupine quills and knitted it all into their hair. Most wore only loincloths. Their bodies were deranged rainbows. Their limbs were bright yellow, and their faces were patterns of green, yellow, black, blue, and purple. Next, Wandering Spirit ordered the other settlers to start walking to the Cree camp. the settlers had no choice but to agree. They felt very uneasy because they were not allowed to go home to get any possessions. Unfortunately, the settlers did not walk many steps before Wandering Spirit released his fury. He sought out the Indian agent Quinn, the man who so often refused to give him the food to feed the hungry Cree. After a few words, one shot rang out. 2 more followed shortly afterwards. Wandering Spirit screamed as his followers to shoot the settlers. Big Bear ran out of the kitchen doorway and screamed at the Cree to stop. Chaos beat down reason amid the hoops and shrieks of the galloping hooves. Some Cree who might not have joined the violence fell into the trance of the war chant that filled the dusty air. The settlers did not immediately realize their danger. They thought that the Cree were simply excited and were firing shots in the air above their heads. One settler started running and was immediately shot down. Then another settler was shot. One man reached out his arm to his wife, and they hit the ground together. The wife leaned over her dying husband and put her face to his. Bullets whizzed by, but she was beyond caring. Many of the Cree were filled with bloodlust now. Yet another man fell to the ground. His wife called for the priest, Father Fafard, to come to say prayers over her dying husband. As he was doing so, Wandering Spirit shot him in the neck. Father Fafard fell on top of the dying man. Father Marchand saw Father Fafard fall and turned back to help him. He was hit by a bullet in the corner of the mouth and was instantly killed. 2 men ran for their lives. They made it about 300 yards, and then they were gunned down by some Cree who were on horseback. During the excitement of the slaughter, John Cameron, the HBC employee, joined a group who were walking towards the camp. They hit him with a blanket as they walked. Cameron kept his head down and tried to stay calm. He made it to the camp, and along with 2 female settlers, he became a prisoner. When there were no settlers left standing, the Cree went from corpse to investigate their work. Father Fafard was still breathing, and the Cree asked another Cree named Papa Makisak, who had been raised by the priest, to shoot him again. Papa Makisak was horrified at the thought of killing Father Fafard, but the Cree taunted him mercilessly. Finally, he shot Father Fafard in the back of the head. The corpses were left on the ground where they fell. Wandering Spirit surveyed the grotesque scene that was his creation. His darkly bronzed features shone in the sun, and he smiled bitterly. He knew that for every man killed, there would be many more soldiers to avenge their deaths. Wandering Spirit was a true warrior. He was both noble and savage. He thought that it would be far nobler to perish quickly in battle than to die in the slow stranglehold of starvation. He was savage in the respect that he took pleasure and felt great pride in killing men. The innocent settlers of Frog Lake were victims of terrorism. They were also part of a corrupt and destructive system that aimed to wipe out the Cree society. One man's hero is another man's villain.